Cemeteries are places of reflection and can tell us a lot about a town's history. While all cemeteries carry with them the whispers of lost stories and people long gone, every town also seems to have that one cemetery. The one everyone says is haunted. Sure, the other grave sites in the area may have their fair share of paranormal activity and history too, but they always seem destined to live in the shadows of the big haunted one. These cemeteries hold special places in their communities, and in a place as spooky as El Paso, Texas, that honor belongs to Concordia Cemetery. Also known as the Boot Hill of El Paso, and one of the most important areas in the city from both a historical and touristic point of view, Concordia Cemetery is the final resting place for a diverse group of over 65,000 souls. From Wild West gunslingers and lawmen to pioneers, buffalo soldiers, and more. There's no shortage of history or notable individuals buried at Concordia Cemetery, which also makes it renowned for its many legends of ghosts and chilling encounters. In this episode, we dive into the history of Concordia Cemetery. We'll examine some of its more ominous legends and stories, and hear from Patricia Kidney, president of the Concordia Heritage Association, who was nice enough to share her expertise on Concordia's past and the ghostly figures rumored to haunt the cemetery. I'm Adrian Mesa, and you're listening to Weird Tales from El Paso. Concordia Cemetery has a bit of a quirky reputation in El Paso. Located right off of I-10, it's almost impossible to travel across the city without passing it by. And directly across the street is L&J's Cafe, one of the city's best and most famous Mexican restaurants, also known affectionately as the old place by the graveyard. Where else can you chow down on some of the best tacos and enchiladas in town, then walk off your meal with a stroll through a huge and spooky cemetery? It's a unique mix of history, local flavor, and a bit of morbid fun you can only find in El Paso. Like I said, quirky. But before we get into what makes Concordia such a spooky spot, first, a quick history recap to understand why Concordia is so important to the El Paso community. Recognized today as a historic Texas cemetery by the Texas Historical Commission, Concordia Cemetery started as a trading post and ranch along the Santa Fe Trail. Hugh Stevenson, a prominent early settler of El Paso, and his wife, Juana Azcárate Stevenson, built the ranch on part of the 900 acres they received as Juana's wedding dowry after they married in 1828. This land extended from the Rio Grande to present-day Chelsea Street and Montana Avenue, covering a sizable portion of today's central El Paso. Named after Hugh Stevenson's childhood home of Concordia, Missouri, the Concordia Ranch, or Rancho Concordia, was officially established in the 1840s. The ranch offered many goods and services to travelers and the El Paso community alike, including trade, lodging, blacksmithing, and even use of San Jose de Concordia el Alto, a chapel Juana was especially proud of. It's here that Concordia's first use as a burial site came in 1856, when Juana was, strangely and tragically, gored by her pet deer, becoming the future cemetery's first permanent resident. Her tombstone is still present in the cemetery today, with the words, First Lady of Concordia, etched on the top. Ownership of the land fluctuated quite a bit during and after the Civil War, with the 900 acres being purchased and divided among Hugh and Juana's 6 children during the Reconstruction, before again being sold to different landowners. The area that would become Concordia Cemetery even briefly served as the location of Fort Bliss from 1867 to 1869. And following the arrival of the railroads in 1881, and with them the start of the area's urbanization, the El Paso City Council deemed it unsanitary to bury loved ones in backyards. A very common custom back in the time that contributed to all the bodies still being found across the city to this day, I should add. The council mandated that all burials be done in established cemeteries, and by 1882, they purchased the land that would become Concordia Cemetery with the initial plan of establishing a cemetery for the poor. And as different landowners began acquiring sections of the cemetery over the following years, Concordia's layout was eventually divided into several distinct burial sections: Chinese, African American, Masonic, Catholic, Jewish, Protestant, military, county, Mormon, and the Buffalo Soldier Memorial, highlighting just how diverse the El Paso community actually is. There's also the Nursery Cemetery, made up of hundreds of unmarked graves of children who died during the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. Not to be confused for the spot with a creepy crib marking one of the graves, but more on that a little later. Today, Concordia Cemetery stands as one of the few remaining pioneer-era spots in the city, a 52-acre reminder of El Paso's Wild West days. Since the 1840s, the cemetery has grown, shrunk, and been divided numerous times, making it difficult to define its exact boundaries. Sure, there are large rock walls and metal gates surrounding the cemetery, with homes and restaurants nearby, but the true extent of Concordia's boundaries remains uncertain. If you ever find yourself driving past the cemetery on I-10, there's a good chance you might be driving over bodies of long-gone residents who were never moved. Something I always think about when traveling across the city. Heck, you might even be sitting over somebody, or bodies, while enjoying your tacos at L&J's.
We are a group of volunteers who came together in 1990, over 30 years ago, when we saw that there was no one in particular taking care of this 52-acre cemetery.
Meet Patricia Kidney, president of the Concordia Heritage Association. Thanks to her efforts and those of countless volunteers over the years, they've kept Concordia alive, so to speak, and have ensured that the cemetery remains a fun and relevant historical landmark in El Paso. I caught up with Patricia at Concordia, where she graciously shared tons of fascinating history and stories about the hauntings of the cemetery. I have to admit, it's not every day I get to interview someone surrounded by endless fields of headstones and, presumably, ghosts. And if Patricia and the many paranormal groups in the city are to be believed, there are a lot of them.
There are reports of sounds, smells, atmospheric changes, having cold spots, seeing glimpses of shadow people, talking to someone, and then looking around a minute later and there's no one there, and things of that nature.
So the thing about Concordia Cemetery, I think some people have actually referred to it as one of the most haunted cemeteries. When you have a cemetery like that with that type of history, I would not doubt it at all that you're going to have things happening there.
This is Ramiro Galvan, independent paranormal investigator and founder of Paranormal Research Investigations, PRI, in El Paso, Texas.
I'm not sure when exactly the stories began. I mean, I can tell you from my personal experiences. For me, I heard them as early as back as the 1960s. I used to live across the street from Concordia. And so back then, they had a summer program and what we call Lincoln Heights right there, right? The rec center. So during the summer, we would go there, and play games, basketball, board games, things like that. However, once they started digging the north-south freeway, started excavating for that, they were forcing us to reroute and go the long way around to get to Lincoln Heights. So a lot of people, what they were doing is that they would cut across on Yandell and then cut across the cemetery to get to it, which was a much shorter way. But even back then, as the stories now, even back then, people would often report seeing shadows, they would hear voices over there, things like that. And I'm talking back in the 60s. So, it got to the point where people were like, nope, we ain't going through there.
I also have been visited at my house after we were out here doing flags for a Memorial Day about several years ago. And I woke up, and standing at the foot of my bed were 4 gentlemen in different military type garments. And because I'm a student of history, I recognized they were from Civil War, War of 1812, things of that nature. And I just said to them out loud, I said, I am sure that you're here to thank me for remembering and taking care of your final resting place. And they just faded away.
Visitors to Concordia have also reported encounters with many of the individual figures said to roam the cemetery, including one of its most famous ghostly residents, Florida J. Wolf, affectionately known as Lady Flo.
Oh, yes, we love Lady Flo's history. Lady Flo was a freed slave, and she and her family were in Chihuahua. And this Englishman, who was sort of the black sheep of the family, he was like the Prince Harry of the 1860s and 70s. And he had been disowned by his family and given a certain amount of money and said, "Go west, please, you're disgracing our name." So he came out to this area. He ended in Chihuahua, and he became very ill. And the people whose family she was hired to work for were good friends with him. His name was Beresford. And so she nursed him back to health. And then they became good friends and later fell in love, and he asked her to, of course, marry him. And the segregation was still operating here in the States, but in Mexico there was no problem for them to be married. So they had a ranch that was in northern Chihuahua, sort of in the south of Douglas area, I believe. And it was very prosperous. She managed the ranch. When they would come to El Paso, she would assume the role of a slave walking behind her master. But they entertained royalties. They entertained grandly here in El Paso. And he was on a cattle buying trip in Canada for some reason. The train wrecked, and he was killed in the train wreck. So she lived out her life here in El Paso. She had to fight very hard. She got pennies on the dollar for her interest in the ranch. The family, of course, being from England, refused to acknowledge her marriage. But she held her head up, and she was a very, very wealthy, charitable, generous, respectable woman.
Also known as the Lady in White, Lady Flo is said to roam the cemetery grounds at night, politely tipping her hat to visitors lucky enough to catch a glimpse of her before continuing on with her ghostly stroll and disappearing. It's good to know she hasn't lost a bit of the charm and class she was so well known for, huh? While Lady Flo adds a touch of elegance to the eerie atmosphere, other parts of Concordia remind you that you are still in a cemetery, and not every visitor is there for spooky fun or history lessons. Remember that quote-unquote creepy crib I mentioned earlier? This area of Concordia is said to be one of the most paranormally active spots in the cemetery. Many have reported hearing the laughter and play of unseen children, and many shadow figures, some appearing to be children and some not, have also been captured on camera near the crib. But the crib itself, adorned with many toys left by visitors, is not as creepy as you might think. In actuality, it marks the final resting place for Cynthia Jimenez, who tragically passed away in 1971 after only living for one day. Cynthia's father, Luis Salvador Jimenez, placed the crib as a memorial to his daughter, an everlasting reminder of the eternal love and grief Cynthia's family has for her.
These people lost their baby, who had been long awaited, and the baby was born early. The mother was able to hold the baby for a couple of, maybe an hour, to stroke her, to smell her, to hear her cry before she passed. I see these people out here working and renovating and freshening that crib. It's a little white crib under the cedar trees. The mother, her grief is as deep as though it happened the day before. I see her out in public, and we just stand and cry together and hug, because I have shared that with her. I've stood there, and the thing about me is I just have this heart that feels and can empathize, and whether it was 50 years ago or yesterday, people come here in a state of grief, and I recognize that and deal with it in a loving, respectful manner.
The crib also seems to be a favorite spot for the Lady in Black, another of Concordia's better-known figures, and one who can be spotted both during the day and at night. Though I couldn't find much to provide a historical context for her, legend has it that the Lady in Black was a woman who tragically lost her husband shortly after their wedding. Despite her overwhelming grief, she visited his grave every day until her own passing, and is said to have continued visiting even after her death.
The Lady in Black is one I have talked to, and she was back there at where the baby crib is, and I passed by, And as I do when I come here, I stop and I ask people, do you need any help? Do you need any water? Are you finding the person you're looking for? And this lady was facing a gentleman sitting on our wooden bench that we have around the base of the tree there. And he didn't say anything, but when I asked, do you need any help? She turned to me and said, we're fine, thank you. She had on a long black skirt and a white blouse and a black shawl, and her hair was done up in a bun, a black bun. And later that evening, I was in a meeting, and I asked one of the ghost investigators how his investigation had gone the week before. He said, we saw a lot of the lady in black. And I said, what? Tell me about the lady in black. He described the lady I just saw.
All the history, remembrance, and playful or polite ghostly encounters at Concordia Cemetery doesn't mean it lacks a dark side, because it definitely has one, and it runs deep. Over the years, visitors and Concordia officials alike have stumbled upon many items scattered throughout the grounds linked to satanic rituals, witchcraft, and brujeria.
There are people who leave items of death wishes and jars with pictures, death to this person. They leave effigy items, little dolls with pens and notes and death to these people. There are genuine death items that are found here. When we find them, the police department has told us that we have to report them. And they then do some investigation, because many times it goes further. It goes into cartel issues and things of that nature.
These unsettling discoveries also include severed body parts, both human and animal, jars filled with strange fluids and blood, personal artifacts like hair and voodoo dolls, vandalized tombstones, crosses placed upside down, and more.
But the thing is, we don't know who's actually has done these type of rituals there. We don't know if these are people who are truly vested in what they're doing, or are these just, people, oh yeah, you know what, it's bored. I'm bored Saturday. Hey, let's go play over here. Let's go do these things over here, Kind of like when people tell you, Bloody Mary, go, in a party, hey, go in there and, call Bloody Mary. Nobody's ever caught these people. And unfortunately, they don't have security cameras out there, so they don't know.
A lot of these ritualistic artifacts have been found concentrated in an area known as Hell's Gate, located near the nursery and Jewish sections of the cemetery. Visitors to this section of Concordia often report feeling unease and a heavy atmosphere. And similar to Hell's Gate is another notorious area known as the Vortex, easily identifiable by the large 3 cedar trees marking its spot within the cemetery. The Vortex is notorious for its abundance of reported paranormal activity, including strange electromagnetic disturbances that affect devices and drain batteries, the ever-classic shadow people, EVPs, sightings of figures cloaked in black, orbs, and an overall sense of heaviness, and in some cases, malevolence. I can personally vouch for some of this reported activity. Earlier this year, while on a ghost tour of Concordia, myself experienced what I can only call a freak out while we were near the Vortex. Something that hadn't happened before and hasn't happened again since. While the cause could easily be something not paranormal, I have to admit it was still a freaky experience given the stories and where it was.
I had some coworkers at the time where I was working at for AT&T, and they heard about what I did. So they wanted me to give them a private tour of Concordia. So I made it, we arranged it, we met there. And we're walking around, and it's twilight, meaning the sun is setting, but it was still light enough that you could see from one end of the cemetery to the other. And we could see that we were the only ones there. So we had been walking around, and we started walking down this gravel path toward Hardin's gravesite. And about halfway down, one of the guys who was doing the tour for us, he stopped. And I asked, and I looked at him, and I'm going, what's going on? He goes, I thought I saw something over there, like a fast-moving shadow. And of course, trying to be rational, I'm going, well, it's on that side of the cemetery that's closer to I-10. It's on the south side of the cemetery, and it probably reflection of headlights, sort of, playing tricks on our eyes. Oh, okay. So we turned around, started walking back, and just as I turned around, out of my peripheral vision, I saw something fast and dark go, just fly across. And I stopped and I go, you know what? I just saw something too. Let's walk back over there. So we're walking back on that same gravel path. And about 10 feet behind me is one of my coworkers, a young lady named Sandra. And next thing I know, I hear her scream. And I stopped and turned around, and she's running, and she's terrified. And she said that she heard footsteps, or she heard somebody walking on the gravel behind her, even though nobody was there, and that she felt somebody grab her arm. Now, it just so happened to be right at that spot where probably about 60 feet away from that grove of trees that's there in the middle.
Many paranormal experts speculate that the unsettling atmosphere and heightened activity at the vortex can be linked to Richard Ramirez, the infamous serial killer known as the Night Stalker. Ramirez, who was born in El Paso, allegedly spent many nights at Concordia Cemetery, either sleeping under the 3 cedar trees marking the vortex, or engaging in satanic rituals and animal sacrifices before embarking on his deadly reign of terror in Los Angeles. While this makes for a great and spooky detail in the story of the vortex, I have to be honest and say it's hard to determine how much of this is true versus how much is just speculation. From what I've personally been able to find, Ramirez never actually conducted any rituals at Concordia, simply visited and slept often since he lived nearby. Still, it is one more chilling aspect of the cemetery's legends. I'd also like to point out that there's an old episode of Ghost Adventures where the team investigates Concordia and the vortex specifically. I've included a link to a clip from that episode in the show notes, for those of you looking for a more dramatic sneak peek at the vortex. And at this point, I'd like to mention the vortex's more formal and quote-unquote official name, Selman's Grove, named after John Selman. He's best remembered as the controversial lawman who ended the life of John Wesley Hardin, the notorious Wild West outlaw and El Paso's answer to Billy the Kid. Both Hardin and Selman are buried in Concordia and are the central figures in the cemetery's most celebrated story and a major draw for tourists.
The story of his death is he's someone who made some mistakes in his youth. He fought for what he thought was right. He never robbed a bank. He never deliberately sought out problems. But because he was charismatic and just really, I think, good-looking and reckless, people sought him out to see if they could be better than he was. So he ended up killing 42 people. But he liked to say in his autobiography, I never killed anybody who didn't need killing. So he was eventually tried for the killing of a deputy sheriff in Comanche, Texas, and was sentenced to 25 years hard labor in a Huntsville prison in Texas. He served 15 years and got out then on good behavior. During that time, he realized he needed to stop fighting the system and go with it.
Hardin was released from prison in 1894, and after passing various law exams and dealing with lingering legal issues, he made his way down to El Paso in 1895 and started a law practice. One of his first clients happened to be Helen Beulah Morose, a former prostitute married to the quote-unquote Polish cowboy, Martin Morose. Both had been arrested in Mexico due to Martin's cattle rustling, and they hired Hardin as their lawyer. While both Martin and Beulah were able to get out of jail, Martin couldn't return to the U.S. due to pending charges that awaited him on the other side of the border. He'd be arrested the moment he crossed into the United States. Beulah, on the other hand, happily returned to El Paso with Hardin, and they very quickly became very close. She began helping Hardin with his many day-to-day tasks, and they even began using Martin's cattle rustling money to fund Hardin's other business ventures. Meanwhile, U.S. Deputy Marshal George Scarborough made many trips to Juarez to convince Martin to return to Texas and face his charges. Scarborough even delivered messages from Martin to Beulah, urging her to come to Juarez and be with him, but she obviously refused. On June 29, 1895, Martin's desire to resolve matters, whether for Beulah's sake or to settle the many scores he had with Hardin, led him to agree to meet Scarborough on the central bridge between El Paso and Juarez to turn himself in. When Martin arrived, at around 11 p.m., he was greeted on the El Paso side by Scarborough and several other lawmen. As they tried to arrest him, Martin pulled a pistol, prompting Scarborough and the heavily armed officers to open fire, quickly turning Beulah into the Widow Morose. Despite this being the official account of Martin's death, it remains unclear if Hardin had a hand in setting up Martin's demise. Regardless, both Hardin and Beulah were the only ones to attend Martin's funeral in Concordia shortly thereafter. But things didn't get easier for Hardin after Martin's death. Despite the obvious affection they shared, Hardin and Beulah had a very chaotic relationship, fueled by a steady stream of alcohol. It became very common to see them arguing and threatening each other around town. And just a few weeks after burying Martin, Beulah got into trouble at a bar, and, after causing a disturbance with her gun, was arrested by Officer John Selman Jr. Hardin didn't take too kindly to Selman Jr.'s arrest of his woman, and he made those feelings very well known to Selman's father, Constable John Selman Sr., a notorious and controversial figure in his own right. And on August 19, 1895, after a heated argument full of threats directed at John Selman Sr., Hardin went to his usual watering hole, the Acme Saloon. Later that night, John Selman Sr. arrived at the saloon, pulled out his gun, and shot Hardin in the back of the head. Hardin immediately collapsed, and Selman fired additional shots into him as he lay dying on the floor. Hardin was buried in Concordia Cemetery the next day, ironically just 3 graves away from Martin Morose. John Selman Sr. was arrested for the unprovoked murder and went to trial, claiming self-defense, only to be shot and killed by none other than George Scarborough on April 6, 1896, for killing one of Scarborough's friends years before. Selman was also buried in Concordia, near the spot that would later be known as the Vortex, or Selman's Grove. George Scarborough later moved to Deming, New Mexico, and passed away in April of 1900 due to complications from gunshot wounds. Beulah died a few years after that in 1907 in Sacramento, California, marking the end of this strange and violent odyssey from El Paso's Wild West era. This is a very simplified version of the events surrounding John Wesley Hardin's death, and each of these figures could honestly be the subject of their own podcast series. I just hope I've clearly conveyed the main points and sparked your interest enough to maybe do some of your own digging. A great way to dive deeper into this story is through the Concordia Heritage Association's annual Secret Society of John Wesley Hardin event and celebration. Every year around the anniversary of Hardin's death, the association commemorates the life and death of Concordia's most famous resident with reenactments of the deadly shootout at the Acme Saloon, performed by the Six Guns and Shady Ladies troupe. It's a fun and family-friendly way to get to know Concordia while celebrating its history. Hardin's notorious life and dramatic death cemented his status as a celebrity of the Wild West, making his grave one of the most visited tourist sites in all of El Paso. During my interview with Patricia at Hardin's grave, we were interrupted a few times by tourists eager to visit Hardin, including a group from San Angelo, Texas, and others who had traveled all the way from Charleston, South Carolina. So whether you're into history, ghost stories, or both, Concordia Cemetery has something for everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the past and the paranormal at Concordia Cemetery. And if you want to explore further, please be sure to check out the resources I've shared in the show notes. And the next time you visit Concordia Cemetery, be it for the first time if you're from out of town or the 100th if you live nearby, please say hi to Lady Flo for me. Until next time, keep it weird, El Paso. Weird Tales from El Paso is produced, written, and edited by me, Adrian Mesa, with original music by Aaron Mesa. I'd like to thank all the guests of the podcast for sharing their stories and expertise with us, and for their contribution to the folklore and culture of the borderland. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, review, and subscribe to stay up to date on new episodes. And if you'd like to share your own experience with us, please reach out at bluelabpro.com/WTF El Paso. Thanks.